Thank you very much, Jason and Miles. And I will try to be within my time, but please do give me a warning when I need to shut up. So, good morning, everybody. Let me start by making two apologies. The first one is that for those of you who are addicted to slides, I don't have any. So you're going to have to just look at me and listen to me. And the second one is to the organizers with regard to the topic they gave me, which I felt was a little bit too big and broad for me to carry on my shoulders. So I'm going to do what Janos did, which is to provide some insights and views from my perspective that I hope talk to the topic itself, but are more specific and with regard to the potential for research opportunities going forward. But before I do that, let me give you two bits of background information. Firstly, on myself, so you know where I'm coming from. I have two institutional hats. I'm a senior fellow at the International Institute for Environment and Development in London, where I've been for the last 15 years or so. Initially, I started and headed the climate change program there. And then more recently, in the last few years, I've become a senior fellow and seconded from IID to Bangladesh to help set up a new center there, which is a joint venture between IID in the UK and a university in Bangladesh called the Independent University Bangladesh. And this center is called the International Center for Climate Change and Development. We run a master's program in climate change and development, and we do a fair amount of research, mainly on adaptation to climate change, and now more recently on loss and damage to climate change. And so my background, research background, is in the issue of adaptation, particularly for the vulnerable countries and communities, and now increasingly on loss and damage. I also have been associated with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I was a lead author of the adaptation chapter in the third assessment report, together with Professor Ian Burton, who's here with us, in 2001, which really started the adaptation bandwagon rolling. And then subsequently in the fourth assessment report, I was the coordinating lead author of a chapter that looked at the synergies and trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation, together with Richard Klein. And in the last fifth assessment report, I was, again, a coordinating lead author of the first of four chapters on adaptation, chapter 14, which looked at planning adaptation. The other chapters looked at implementation and limits and economics of adaptation. And most recently, I was invited to the scoping meeting for the special report on the 1.5 degrees IPCC report. So a long history with the IPCC, again, focusing on the issue of adaptation. The other bit of background that I want to share with you, which you've already heard about, but I'll give it to you from my perspective, is the fight for and the final inclusion of the 1.5 degree temperature goal in the Paris Agreement. For those of you who didn't follow this very closely, let me tell you what happened. At the beginning of the 21st Conference of Parties on the 30th of November, there were just roughly 100 countries that were proposing the inclusion of a 1.5 degree goal. They were the most vulnerable, poorest countries in Asia, Africa, small island states, very much in the lead. None of the developed countries wanted it. None of the large developing countries like China and India wanted it. Over the next 12 days, by the time we reached the end of the COP on the late night on the 12th of December, every single country had signed up to it. And that, to me, was a triumph of diplomacy, advocacy, persuasion from the vulnerable countries to the large developing countries, as well as rich developed countries, to persuade them to do something that they weren't really willing to do. But they did in the end, on moral grounds, to protect the most vulnerable. So that was a big win in diplomacy. The hard work now starts in implementing that agreement. And I'm going to pick on three main messages that you might call recommendations, or you might even call them challenges to the research community, to research institutions, to researchers, and indeed to research funders, on how we need to move forward from here to implement that, and in particular what it means for the vulnerable countries. One other piece of background. When I say vulnerable countries, I'm talking about the small island states. There's 40 plus of them in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean. The least developed countries, who are the poorest countries in the world, is about 50 of them, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asia, including my country, Bangladesh. And then a number of other countries in Africa who are also affected by droughts and floods. This is the UNFCCC recognized groupings, 3 groupings, of what are called particularly vulnerable countries. And they number roughly 100 countries, which is a significant number because the total number of countries in the UN Framework Convention are 195. So 100 vulnerable countries are actually a majority of all countries. However, these 100 countries only account for roughly 5% of global emissions. The other countries account for 95% of global emissions. So if we are going to achieve a 1.5 degree long-term goal, these countries aren't going to be able to do it on their own. They're going to need other countries to do that. On the other hand, these countries will suffer. If we were to look at the impacts of 1.5 versus 2 degrees, then the geographies and communities that will be affected in the margins of that 0.5 degrees between 2 and 1.5 will predominantly be from these countries and these communities and the ecosystems where they are. Small islands, low-lying coasts, arid lands in mid-continents. And so reaching 1.5 degrees matters to them much more than it matters to others. On the other hand, getting to 1.5 degrees is not going to come from them, it's going to come from others. And so for them, the highest task, the most important task, is to prepare themselves to deal with the impacts of climate change. And so from an adaptation perspective, for these vulnerable countries, what we are doing is we are preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. So right now, we are looking at 3 degrees temperature rise, and we're looking to ways in which we might be able to adapt to that at the national level, at the local level, at the city level, at various different scales within countries and across countries. We, as I said, are not the ones who are going to deliver 1.5 degrees. We hope that the rest of the world will actually deliver that 1.5 degree temperature rise so that we don't have to adapt to the higher levels of that temperature. And so, as MJ Mace yesterday made the point of having if you like, a normative view of what kind of research is required, I would argue that research that helps the small island developing states, the least developed countries, and the countries in Africa who are all vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and will suffer not reaching 1.5 degree temperature rise are, in my view, your clients, if you like. They are the ones who pushed for the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees. They are the ones that want that report. They are the ones that need the science that will underlie and underpin that report so that policymakers can then make further decisions when the report comes out in 2018. So a short-term perspective of the special report on 1.5 degrees with a normative research agenda, particularly focusing on these countries. And as I said, in the adaptation arena, it's very much about learning by doing. So adaptation is not something that you do from theory to practice, but from practice to theory and then back again. And there's a lot of practice and activities taking place in the developing world. So I would issue my first, if you like, recommendation or message or invitation to all of the researchers in the room, and particularly young researchers, who have an interest in working on adaptation, particularly in vulnerable countries, with vulnerable countries, to associate themselves with the countries that are actually taking actions. We had a very nice presentation on Maldives yesterday from one of the young researchers here. And if you're interested in coming to Bangladesh, which is doing a lot of things as well, I'd be very happy to talk to you and enable you to come and do some research work there. And I assure you there's a lot of things happening in Bangladesh that are worth looking at for the rest of the world. And there's a lot of things that the rich world can actually learn from the poor world when it comes to adapting to the impacts of climate change. Because the rich are not particularly well adapted. The poor sometimes are better adapted. So that's my first, if you like, message on behalf of these vulnerable countries to the research community to carry out further research, particularly focusing on adaptation. The second recommendation, or the second constituency for whom I wish to make an appeal, are not the developing countries or the vulnerable countries as such, but rather communities, vulnerable communities. And here, communities, poor and vulnerable communities, although they overlap very largely with the poor and vulnerable countries, are not exclusively in the poor and vulnerable countries. There are, even in rich countries, if you look at the impacts of climate change, they tend to fall disproportionately on the poorer and the more vulnerable communities within rich countries. And the classic example was when Hurricane Katrina hit the coast of Louisiana and New Orleans. More than 1,000 people died. None of them were rich people or even middle-class people in New Orleans. They were all the poor people living in the Ninth Ward, who all happened to be black as well. And so even in a rich country, it is the poor and vulnerable communities that are the most impacted by the impacts of climate change. And again, for whom the difference between a 2-degree rise and a 1.5-degree rise matters. And so looking at the most vulnerable communities and how they can be analyzed, helped, evidence collected to support their ability to cope with the impacts of climate change, to me, requires prioritization and focus. And in particular, I can share with you a movement, if you like, or a community of practice on community-based adaptation that's been going on for now a decade, where we gather together every year. We have an international conference on community-based adaptation every year somewhere in the world, where we get several hundred people coming together. We had it in Bangladesh earlier this year. Next year, we'll be doing it in Kampala in Uganda at the Makerere University there. And as I said, we bring together communities, practitioners, NGOs, funders, researchers who are interested in community-based adaptation, and in particular, how science can help the most vulnerable communities. As I said, I am greatly in favor of doing research that is normative, that is going to help people, not just be published in a peer-reviewed journal article and then sit there and have half a dozen people read it. And my third challenge, and this one is a challenge rather than a message, is particularly to the research funding community on not Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which is where the 1.5-degree long-term goal is, but on Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, which was also a very hard-fought article going into the negotiations at COP21 in Paris. In fact, the developed countries under the leadership of the United States did not want this article at all. If you looked at the negotiating text going into Paris, for every article there was a recommendation or an option A from the developing countries and an option B from the developed countries. And then over the course of the COP, we negotiated that into the Paris Agreement. When it came to Article 8, which was on loss and damage, the developing countries had an option A, and the option B from the developed countries, Annex 1 countries, was delete this article. So they didn't offer any language. They said, we don't want this article. And for the next 2 weeks, we negotiated very, very hard with them. And in the end, we do have that article. We have an Article 8 on loss and damage in the Paris Agreement, which to me is extremely pertinent for the issue of 1.5 degrees, because if we fail to reach 1.5 degrees, we do have to think about loss and damage. And when it comes to loss and damage, it is a very politically sensitive issue, because for most developed countries, the reason they don't want to talk about it or include it in the negotiations is it opens up, from their perspective, the two taboo areas that they don't want to talk about, which is liability and compensation. And when we talk about loss and damage, they hear liability compensation. So we do have an agreement. We have something called the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. It has 9 work areas, so I would recommend that those of you who are interested in doing research, all of these areas of research, they include vulnerability, risk management, slow onset events like sea level rise, non-economic loss and damage, all under-researched areas of looking at loss and damage. You can find them listed on the UNFCCC website on the Warsaw International Mechanism. In fact, the executive committee is meeting exactly as we speak here this week in Bonn, and will produce recommendations for the next conference of parties in Marrakesh in November. So let me appeal both to the research funders and the researchers who are looking for something new to work on. This is an under-researched area, and I speak now on behalf of Southern researchers from developing countries who have an interest in research on this issue, but don't have access to funding for it. So I hope we can find ways of collaborating to work on this. Thank you very much.